3 more after this one. So as you probably will remember, this is actually the title of our course that we've been on for quite a number of weeks now is an overview of world history. This is not meant to cover everything that happened in the history of all the world. So you couldn't possibly do that in a short period of time. But we're trying to hit the very important points, the high spots, the things that will spur your interest, hopefully, to study more. Because it is fascinating to look at what has happened and all the intricacies and different things that took place. It's really amazing. History, remember, is what? It's His story. And the Lord, who knows all things, has always had His hand in all the things that took place in the world. It's amazing to watch what has happened. Of course, you might say, well, how about all the tragedies and awful things? That's the result of sin. The reason there's trouble in the world is because of sin. Of course, you won't be taught that in a secular history course. By the way, the word secular, like in a secular school, secular history course, secular means without God. And we don't want to do anything or try to do anything without God. You know why? The Lord said, without me you can do nothing. So anything that's secular is worthless, isn't it? Okay. We'd like to open with prayer. Father in heaven, we do thank Thee, Lord, for this class tonight, and I thank Thee that we can study, that we can learn about the things that have happened and give Thee the glory for all things, knowing that Thou art the living God, that Thou sittest in the heavens, that Thou rulest in the hearts of men. I pray that Thou wouldst help us now to be wise, to have understanding and wisdom, that we can learn these things and that we can be touched in our hearts to know how Thou hast preserved us unto this very hour. Be with us now, I pray. Strengthen our faith. Help us to have an attitude of learning. I just ask all of this now in the name of the Lord Jesus. Amen. Amen. One of the things I'd like to do is I am going to back up just a little bit. We're talking about the period of expansion after the Civil War. I think it would be good if I could back up to look at the expansion leading up to the Civil War. See, the United States, we are studying U.S. history at this point. The United States went through several periods of great expansion. Not only geographically. What do I mean by geographic expansion? The acquisition of land. Just getting bigger in the sense of the country having more land. More states being added. But other kinds of expansion. Financial or money expansion. Business expansion. Agricultural expansion. Great periods of growth, and a lot of things took place. And because there's sin in the world, and because the United States also has sin in it, or hadn't you noticed? There were all kinds of intrigues going on. There were some people that got greedy. Did you know people can get greedy? There are some people that started wars. There are some people who wanted to control the money because it's power that they want. Some people are not satisfied unless they can control other people. It's just a lust that they have, wanting to control someone or a large number of people. So there are all kinds of different emotions that are at work here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a timeline, and I'm doing this for the purpose of getting it on the tape recording. I don't have anything written out. Now, if my wife will help me, we can probably put together a timeline at the end of the course that'll go through the whole thing. And then you can have that, and you can kind of study it over on your own. I mean, after all, what else do you have to do this summer, right? And I'm sure that I'll find all of you sitting in your little corner this summer studying the timeline of history. I can just picture it. All right. You know what I used to do on Friday nights? What do most people do on Friday nights? A night off. I'm talking about when I was in high school now, right? A night off. Go to the football game. Go to the basketball game. Go to the dances. All this kind of stuff. That's what everybody else was doing. You know what Meyer was doing? He was sitting in the public library studying. On Friday nights? Yeah. What I'm teaching you, most of what I'm teaching you, I know because I studied it and I put a lot of time into this. I don't consider myself to be a scholar. I'm not a professor. I'm a student. I'm still learning. I'm no expert at all, but I'm willing to teach you what I've been able to learn through a lot of hard work, and it wasn't easy. Maybe I make it look easy, but it wasn't. It takes a lot of effort. But once you have it in your mind, it's there. When you expend effort, they always say no pain, no gain. You've got to expend some effort and really put forth a lot of, you have to have some get up and go and really put forth that effort, and you will find it pays off. Always. An investment in education always pays the best interest. Okay, enough said. I'm just trying to give you a little pep talk, get you fired up, light a fire under you, get you motivated and moving here. If I see anybody yawn, we'll do arm circles. Okay? When I was in German class, the German instructor used to make us do that. He said the highest sin, die höchste Sünde, the highest sin is to yawn in German class. Okay? Oh, by the way, I'd like to find out at some point what you would like to study next year. Maybe you'd like to learn German. I'd be glad to teach you German if you feel like you want to learn that. Maybe you want to learn a science. Maybe you want more history. I don't know. But you can let me know what you'd like to do, and I'd be glad to delve into it. I mean, I know I'm starting late, but now the younger children here, Jane and Sam and Jane and Vicki and Anna, they'll be having a lot of courses by the time they're in high school that I will have taught. And so I'm hoping to get as much into you older ones as I can before you get out of school. And this is Nate's last year, so he's just about finished with his high school education here. All right. Now, we prayed. I gave you a little pep talk, so let's go. What I want to do is back up all the way to 1816, just for a minute. And we're going to move forward rather rapidly from there, and I'd like to explain a few things that happened as the country expanded after the Revolutionary War, moving toward the Civil War. We spent some time on the Civil War last week, so I'm going to just kind of glide over that and then move into the second expansion up to the First World War. And I'd like to land on that and spend a little time on that too. And time is very precious and moves quickly, so we have exactly 1 hour. And I will stop promptly at 8:30. Okay. In 1816, a number of things began to take place. For one thing, there was some concern in the country about things being imported. All right? If you are manufacturing things in this country, making things, and you want to sell things, what would happen if you could import things cheaper than you could make them here? Well, everybody would want to buy the imports, right? You know what I mean? What if things could be made in England or France cheaper than they could be made over here, and you ship those things in? What happens to our businesses here? Trouble, right? So what happened is Congress passed a tariff law, the Tariff Law of 1816, and what that did is that encouraged the manufacture of American goods because you put a special tax. A tariff is a special tax on imported things. Okay? And what that did is it made the foreign things higher priced, so it encouraged you to buy American. Understand how that works? Of course, some bad people got a hold of tariffs later on and started putting tariffs on things where they didn't belong. Would you like an example of that? Okay. Did you know that the only place in the world that produces redwood, you've seen redwood fences and redwood lawn furniture. Redwood is it's very durable wood to use outdoors. The only place in the whole world where redwood grows is in Northern California and in Oregon, maybe just a little bit in southern Washington. But in this country, and yet did you know that there's not one splinter of redwood that isn't imported? because they cut the redwood, they process it, roughly process it. I'm not saying they cut it into boards, but they take these logs, they ship them out beyond the territorial waters, and then they ship them back in and put a tariff on it because then they're imported. That raises the price. And what it also does, it regulates the price really, and it brings in revenue in the form of a tariff. See, the government cashes in on that, don't they? But that's a more recent development. Initially, the tariff plan was actually a pretty good thing because it encouraged American business. And they started realizing way back in 1816, we better do something or all these other countries are going to come in and this will be their market. Okay? So things get a little complicated, don't they? Now, also in that same year, the United States Bank was formed. Actually, this was the second United States Bank that came forth. It was a central bank, and the government regulated it. There was no Federal Reserve yet. We'll get to that later. But there was a central banking house. Otherwise, what you had is a whole bunch of little state banks springing up all over, and everybody printed their own money. Of course, they had to back it with gold or silver, but they had all these little businesses. You and I could start a bank in those days. I mean, Nathaniel Meyer could have Nathaniel Meyer's Bank. And with a name like his, everybody would think he was connected with Rothschild. But anyway, he could start his own little bank if he had the money. If he could talk people into putting money into his bank, he could in turn loan it out and make money on that money. Anybody could do it. So they formed a central bank. All right? Then, as time moved on, all kinds of developments began to take place. The economy began to prosper. There was a prosperity that came forth because of the tariff laws and so forth. Business began to expand. And the country began to grow rapidly. In 1819, the United States got a hold of Florida. Now, who would remember here, who could remember, what country controlled Florida? Who controlled Florida? What European country before it became a state? Sam? Sure, Pancho and Pedro. Yeah, yeah. No, Spain. That's right. Does anybody here know who discovered Florida? Ponce de Leon. Right. Okay. But in 1819, the United States bought Florida for, who wants to guess how much money they paid for it? What would you think Florida cost in those days? Just take a guess. It's in the millions. And the United States got a real deal on this. I'm just curious to see what you'd guess. Take a wild stab at it. 20 million? A little high. It was 5. $5 million is what Florida cost. Okay? Now, something else was happening in the country that later developed into, or helped to foment, what do I mean by foment? To start, to instigate, to crescendo upward towards something. Something began to happen in the country that became a real issue later in the Civil War, called slavery. Slavery. The southern colonies, or states as they were now, they were no longer colonies because we won the Revolutionary War, at least it looked that way. And we did win it, except financially we didn't win it because Britain has never stopped controlling our money system. They still do to this day. But anyway, there was a real problem because as states were admitted into the Union, was it going to be a slave state or a free state? Can you imagine the problem there? If you were a delegate from a slave state, wouldn't it bother you if another one came in that was a free state and these other states were added, and they all came in as free states, you would become a minority. So they would say, we're losing our voice and our power. So there was something called a Missouri Compromise that came forth. And Missouri Compromise was proposed by one Henry Clay of Kentucky. And what this did actually is it maintained a balance between states. If one state came in as a free state, another would have to come in as a slave state. And this is what happened with Missouri. Because when the state of Missouri wanted to enter the Union, they said Missouri has to be slave because we're one out of balance right now. Okay? Any questions on that? You understand what's happening? Now, the Missouri Compromise also stated that any further acquisition of land into the Union, annexation into the Union in the Louisiana Purchase, would have to be free. So they kept working out these compromises and drawing these lines, and there was a real heated problem here developing. Okay? Now, that was in 1820. In 1821, there was a man by the name of Stephen Austin who started a movement in a certain state to break away from Mexico. Can anybody guess what state that was? That was Texas. It wasn't a state yet. It was actually part of Mexico. But a lot of Americans lived there. And Stephen Austin, of course, formed you might say, a little colony down there in 1821. This later developed into a war. Now, in 1823, see, a lot of things are going on all at once here. In 1823, something called the Monroe Doctrine came forth. Now, who would you say authored the Monroe Doctrine? That's almost like saying, what flavor is chocolate ice cream? Who? What is the host of Corn Smut? You know, who authored the Monroe Doctrine? Monroe! Yes, President Monroe. And basically what it did, the Monroe Doctrine separated the eastern and western hemispheres, saying things that go on over on this side of the world, Europe needs to keep its hands out of, or anything on the other side of that dividing line. Okay? So, in other words, he separated the eastern and western hemispheres. The Monroe Doctrine. Very old, right? 1823. Now, see, they're having problems. They didn't want European interference or interference from anywhere else. In 1825, John Quincy Adams was elected president by the House of Representatives after the Electoral College was unable to provide a winner. That's kind of important, isn't it? Here was a president that wasn't elected by the people, which I think is rather interesting. Now, in 1828, Andrew Jackson, now what is he famous for? What was his occupation? Andrew Jackson, who knows? What did he do? He headed up something that is designed to kill people and break things. He was a general. Did you know that's the purpose of any army? To kill people and break things. That's what they're designed to do. But he became president in 1828. And a lot of things began to take place. One of the things that Andrew Jackson did is he strongly opposed any European banking influence. And he caused the European banking powers wanted to invest in this country. But in doing so, they gained a great deal of control over this country. And Jackson stood up to them and said, "No way." And he caused them a lot of grief. And as a result, you had a number of economic upheavals started by the European bankers who already had a foothold in the country. You understand how that works? If you got a country and you're expanding, where's the money going to come from? It comes from people who invest in it. And European investors said, well, if we're putting our money in this, we've got a say in what goes on, and they began to really pull some fast ones. All right? In fact, in 1833, President Jackson literally smashed the Second Bank of the United States because he thought it had too much European control. What that did, remember I said that you had all these little state banks, these little individual banks? When Andrew Jackson dismantled the federal bank, what that did is it left all the little, they call them pet banks, all the little state banks and little individual banks. That strengthened them. And the central bank was out of commission. Now, something happened in 1834 that you might not think is very important, but it was very important. Cyrus McCormick invented something. And it allowed for huge farming enterprises. In other words, not the little family farm anymore necessarily, but you could, with this device that he invented, you could harvest vast amounts of crops. This was monumental, just as Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin greatly eliminated the need for slaves. See, I did say something here I want to correct. A couple of weeks ago, I think, maybe last week it was, I mentioned that the slaves only worked about, 4 to 6 weeks out of the year. And that was after the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Before that, they worked a lot more. But after the cotton gin, the slaves weren't really needed very much anymore because you had a machine that would process the cotton that was picked. Okay? The cotton gin is an invention. It's a machine. It's not a drink. They don't make gin out of cotton. I remember in class, I was telling my history teacher at the time, I said, the name was Bob Erickey. I said, Mr. Erickey, we were very respectful students. You know, we always called our teachers by their proper name. I was respectful. I said, Mr. Erickey, what did Eli Whitney say to his wife after he invented the cotton gin? He said, I don't know. He said to her, keep your cotton picking hands off my gin. Okay, so anyway, now I was a character. I was always known for little jokes like that. They always liked them, though. You know, one time I got up in chemistry class and I was doing a report on ethylene glycol. Ethylene glycol, of course, is used for antifreeze. And I stood up in front of the class very soberly and I was going to give this report, and I said, my report today, and of course my chemistry teacher was a very stern man anyway. He was hard to ever get him to even smile. Very serious-minded. I said, my report today is on ethylene glycol. Ethylene glycol is used to make antifreeze. Of course, the best way to make antifreeze is hide her pajamas. So, anyway, but, and he actually laughed. He really did. So, this device that was invented by Cyrus McCormick was what? The McCormick Reaper. And you recall the story I told about Abraham Lincoln? There was a dispute over the patent, and Edwin M. Stanton, Abraham Lincoln worked together, even though Stanton hated Lincoln. And they won the course for the McCormick, or won they won the law battle for the cause of the McCormick Company. Anyway, in 1836, that is just 2 years after the McCormick Reaper was invented, Texas declared itself independent from Mexico. Now here you've got a people, Stephen Austin started this colonization, but they're in part of Mexico. Texas was part of Mexico, and you got these people saying, we declare our independence. We are no longer part of Mexico. Well, Mexico says, oh yes you are, and they said, oh no we're not. And battles were being fought. One notable battle was fought against a general by the name of Santa Anna, who attacked a certain former mission that was turned into a fort. Does anybody know what that's called? And it's in the city where my wife was born, by the way, the city of San Antonio. What was this building called? Starts with an A. The Alamo. And there was a very famous inventor of a knife who fought in that battle, Jim Bowie. There was a very famous statesman from Tennessee, frontiersman and statesman, Davy Crockett. They fought in that battle, trying to fight for independence. They lost the battle to Santa Anna. Of course, later on, Sam Houston and his troops went after Santa Anna and caused them to surrender. And they were shouting, guess what? Remember the Alamo! Santa Anna was later on in his life was captured. He caused a lot more trouble. And Sam Houston was tried, and he was to be executed by firing squad. Now here's something you will not get in the public school, all right? It's in the history books, but they never teach this. And in a minute you're going to find out why. Santa Anna stood up against a wall with a blindfold on. All right? Sam Houston was out there ready to give the command to shoot him, this firing squad. Santa Anna lifted his hands up like this and said, O Lord my God, is there no help for the widow's son? Sam Houston said, release him and let him go. They were both in the Masonic Lodge brothers. Do you see why they don't teach that? Mick?
We saw in the Alamo, the cornerstone is the Masonic cornerstone.
Is that right?
There's a picture of it.
Well, how about that? I didn't know that. Masonic cornerstone in the Alamo, of all things. But Sam Houston and his enemy, his arch enemy, Santa Anna, were both Masons. So he had to come to his aid and let him go. There are a lot of things in history that aren't explained unless you look at the conspiratorial side of it, which the professors would laugh about. They do. The history professors laugh at that. And I think they have to teach what they teach because they're a part of an institution that would literally, especially if they're not a tenured professor, they'd be out the door in no time if they tried to teach it the way they should. Yeah, in fact, later on, I'm going to try and find a picture to show you in here. In World War II, this was real notable. You would have these old film clips. Used to be you go to a movie theater, and they'd have the movie, but before that they'd have a newsreel. They'd always have a cartoon. They'd have a newsreel. Remember the newsreels? After World War II, they had these newsreels of all these Nazis coming out of these hiding places, bunkers and things. And the infantrymen, the soldiers, the lesser non-officers would come out like this. The officers had always come out like this with a big smile on their face. Huh? That's their distress sign, to hold the hands up, bent at the elbow. You don't even have to say, "O Lord my God, is there no help for the widow's son?" Just by putting your arms up like that, instead of like this, that's the sign of that you need help, that you're appealing to the great architect of the universe, Lucifer. Okay? As they call him. Now, a number of other things began to take place. So Texas declared its independence. Now, in 1837, a man by the name of John Deere introduced the steel plow. Now, the steel plow was quite an invention because it allowed for more vast farming, and that really is what helped this nation grow. Vast food supplies came as a result of this. In 1837, something else happened. They call it the Panic of 1837. The reason that there was a big panic is because there was a depression that set in. There was a lot of land speculation. People put a lot of money into it, and it failed. Money was lost, and there was a massive depression. You know what a depression is? A lot of you young people don't know what a depression is because you've never been through one. In fact, I have never really been through a depression. My dad was. He lived through a depression. There isn't any money. There isn't any money. There are no jobs. You know what the slogan was back during the Depression in the 30s? After the stock market crash in 29, I'm jumping ahead, but you know what the slogan was back then? Kiss the feet of a man who will give you a job. You couldn't get one. You know how you ate? You went to a soup line. They didn't give you food stamps. You went and got a bowl, and there was a big kettle of soup, and they put some in there, and that's how you ate. A depression. People today, I'm concerned because people today are so terribly spoiled. Just look at what happened in Oshkosh last Thursday night, because of the drinking age. 2,000 students run into the street and start busting everything to pieces. What would you have if suddenly they didn't have money, couldn't get a job, and things got rough? What do they do then? You watch. There'll be trouble in the streets. We're just seeing the beginning of it. There's a lot of unrest in Madison yesterday. I don't know if you heard about that. They were celebrating May Day, the big communist day, May 1st, Beltane. And there were a lot of radical groups down there, including heads of labor unions, and they were marching around, and they went out in front of the Capitol, and they had a likeness of Governor Thompson, an effigy. You know what an effigy is? It's a dummy that looks like Governor Thompson, and they burned it. And they were just going absolutely berserk over in Madison. So first you have this thing in Oshkosh, and it's a spirit, you see. It's a spirit of anarchy and rebellion. And it's starting all over again, and it's going to grow. You just watch. There's a lot of unrest. So these things have gone on over a period of time. And here in the last days, they've really come to a head. Anyway, in 1839, there was a Liberty Party that started, and this was an anti-slavery party. That same year, a man by the name of Charles Goodyear developed something. What do you think Charles Goodyear developed? Now think. Put your thinking caps on here. What do you think of when you think of Goodyear? Tires. Goodyear tires. You know what made tires and other rubber products possible? Not latex now. I mean, this is, the black rubber. Okay? Used in a lot of devices. A process called vulcanization. See, rubber comes from trees. And the problem is it dries out and cracks and becomes useless after a little while. So you couldn't use it for much of anything for very long. But Goodyear, quite by accident, was experimenting one time, and by accident he had added some sulfur, spilled some sulfur on some rubber and heated it. It fell onto a stove, and he scraped it off the stove, and he noticed this is an entirely different substance. Now with the sulfur and the heating process, by falling onto this big stove that he had, it was a lot more flexible. It didn't dry out. It was greatly improved, and they call that vulcanized rubber. That's what your tires are made out of. And of course, they made other improvements since then, but then he actually came up with that process and started a company called Goodyear after his name. Now, in 1844, a man by the name of Samuel F.B. Morse invented something. What do you think Morse invented? Morse. Samuel F.B. Morse. Do you know, Stephen? Yeah, he did. You're right. But something else. Morse code is used with a device. What was the device? Morse code. Stephen? The telegraph, right. Anybody know what I just sent? SOS. Did-a-did, da-da-da, did-a-did. See, you don't say dot, 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 dash, dash, dash. It's too hard to say. You say did-a-did, da-da-da, did-a-did when you're speaking Morse code. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. You can send Morse code with telegraph electrically. You can send it with a flashlight. You can send it with flags. When you send it with flags, you can use any flag. And a right, as you're sending, right is always a dot, left is always a dash. And you wave in an 8 pattern. Like an 8. And then it's slow, but you can get your message across. Okay? So, he invented Morse code and the telegraph. That is right, Stephen. In 1845, Texas was added to the Union. Now, when it declared its independence, it called itself the Lone Star Republic, not state. Texas was a republic between 1836 and 1845. Okay, now 1846, the Oregon Treaty was signed, and what that did is that divided the Oregon Territory between Britain and the United States. They split it in half. Okay? Any questions or comments at this point? Sister Pat. Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. And the telegraph was a very important invention because the telephone didn't come along until later. By the way, if you didn't hand in your list of inventions between 1850 and 1900, get them to me as quickly as possible. Okay? Before our next session, because otherwise you'll be marked down for it. You're going to be graded. I mean, this is no joke. You're going to get a grade at the end of this. Okay? In 1847, there was a religious group that started way out in Palmyra, New York. For a while, ended up in Nauvoo, Illinois, and eventually ended up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and arrived in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1847. Do you know the name of the religious group? The leader of which was double-crossed. Did you know that when we better name it first before I tell you about it. Come on, what one was it? The Mormons. Remember, I'd mentioned that Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormons, was a worshipful master in the Masonic Lodge, and so was his brother Hiram. And when they had a colony in Nauvoo, Illinois, one of their enterprises was they counterfeited money. They made counterfeit money because they believed any non-Mormon was just a stupid Gentile, and you could swindle them and it wasn't a sin. You couldn't swindle another Mormon, but you didn't have any problem with the Gentiles, the non-Mormons. You could take them for everything they had and it wouldn't be wrong. See, that's the way the Jews feel about the Gentiles. Same thing. But there was a sheriff in that area of Illinois who was a Freemason in the Masonic Lodge, and so was Joseph Smith. Now, they had a shootout because when they were counterfeiting this money, they were tracking him down, and Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram and a few others were in this little building, and they were having one of these old-time Western shootouts, you know. And Joseph Smith, realizing he wasn't going to win this battle, also recognized the sheriff out there as a Mason. Joseph Smith went out and stood right out there in the range of fire, lifted up his hands and said, "O Lord my God, is there no help for them?" And all of a sudden, bang, they got him. They did it on purpose. They needed a martyr. When Brigham Young took over and led them to Utah, it solidified the Mormons. Now they had a dead man to emulate, to lift up. When a man alive becomes less powerful than needed, all they have to do is shoot him, and then suddenly he is eulogized and looked at as a great and wonderful legend, you see. And it solidifies the movement, makes them strong, makes them stick together. Now they had a martyr. Okay? So they went out, and they were given, actually, they took over the whole state. To this day, Utah is pretty much Mormon. They own it. Okay? In 1847, the same year the Mormons landed in Utah, a man by the name of Elias Howe invented something. I suppose you're wondering how he did it. But Elias Howe invented something that made clothing a lot easier to come by. The sewing machine. Okay? Now, we're going to have to move through the rest of this rather quickly. In 1851, between then and 1856, there developed a very great need for a certain kind of building material. And a man by the name of Sir Henry Bessemer developed a process by which this building material could be made in an inexpensive way. Does anybody know what that building material would be? Do you think you know, Stephen? What did he say? No? Sam? Steel. Sir Henry Bessemer came up with something called the Bessemer converter. The Bessemer converter took iron and using a jet of air traveling underneath, it was like a big cement mixer, standing up kind of at an angle, and you would shoot oxygen through it, and there would be coal in there, carbon, and it would cause the carbon and the oxygen to move through the iron, and you would end up with steel, a much stronger metal than iron is. And it looked different, and it was very, very important to the building industry. Okay? So that was a very important discovery, 1851 to 1856. In 56 it was actually perfected. Now, a lot of other things were going on. I should mention one of these. In 1854, the Republican Party was formed. The Republican Party officially started in 1854. It was called the GOP. Does anybody know what GOP stands for? The GOP. GOP was the Grand Old Party. And do you happen to know, I'm just trying to see, if some of you know these answers, give them to me. I want to know what you've learned or what you know. Does anybody know where the Republican Party started? Any of the children here? It was in Wisconsin, believe it or not. Okay, we'll let... Okay, you want to tell us, Stephen? Do you really know? No. We're looking for a town. It was in Ripon. Ripon, Wisconsin is where the Republican Party started. Now, around this same time, there were anti-slavery forces at battle in the Kansas territory. They called Kansas Bleeding Kansas. This thing was really heating up. And a year later, in 1857, we had what was called the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision was a Supreme Court ruling. And what it did is it ruled that slaves are not citizens of the United States, that they don't have those rights. And just living in a free state didn't set them free. They could be captured and sent back. That was a major decision, caused a lot of anger by anti-slavery people. In 1858, volume after volume has been written about how slavery is a good thing. But I've never yet met the man who's willing to take the good of it by becoming a slave himself. So, quite a profound statement. In 1859, there was an abolitionist. You know what an abolitionist is? Somebody who opposes slavery. There was a movement of abolitionists. They had something called an Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad didn't have any trains in it. It was a means by which slaves were smuggled from the south to the north. And the slaves developed a secret code in the form of a song that helped them communicate and tell other slaves how to get to the north. They had to get north of a certain river. What was that river they had to get north of in order to be free? What river? Remember the Mason-Dixon line? We've flown over that many times. Well, many times. Seems like we did. We've flown over that probably. We've flown near it 6 times already in our few flights that we've had. Flown over it 4 times. The Ohio River. You had to get north of the Ohio River. They had developed a song called Follow the Drinking Gourd. Drinking Gourd was the Big Dipper, which of course was north. So you follow the Drinking Gourd or the Big Dipper and it would take you north. And in the song there were cryptic messages that they would sing. And of course the slave owners thought, well, they're just a bunch of dumb Africans. They don't know what, they're just making those words up. They don't mean anything. But in there were all the instructions on just how to get north of the Ohio River. I could get you the words that I know most of them, but I'm not going to sing on this tape. At least I don't plan to. Okay. So John Brown was a famous abolitionist, and this Underground Railroad was a series of houses. They would take these slaves, sometimes put them under a stack of hay and haul them in a wagon. They'd take them from one farmhouse to the next and eventually get them north of the Ohio River. They'd smuggle them out that way. Also in 1859, a man named Edwin Drake built the nation's first something in Titusville, Pennsylvania. In 1859, what did he build? I don't think anybody will get this. The nation's first oil derrick. Oil. Oil was discovered in Pennsylvania before Texas. Pennsylvania, of course, is sitting on a lot of coal, too. But they discovered oil there, and Pennsylvania oil, of course, you have Penn State oil, don't you? Or Quaker State oil is another one. Okay? Now, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. And that same year, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and we went through a lot of that last time. The Civil War, and of course in 1863 you had the Emancipation Proclamation, and a new National Banking Act came forth. Abraham Lincoln issued money. See, a lot of the money needed to finance the Civil War so the Union could win, a lot of this money had to come from Europe. And that meant the House of Rothschild. Rothschild offered to lend the money to Lincoln at 20% interest. And Lincoln, in other words, basically told him to take a slow boat to China. He absolutely flatly refused and torpedoed the entire scheme. Instead, he printed Abe Lincoln greenbacks, the first green money ever printed. And he issued it without any bank. The government issued it. Okay? Not a bank. The government itself. And there was a lot of concern as to whether the government really had enough backing to really make this paper money any good. And so in this National Banking Act, it was also written that you did not have to back the paper with gold and silver. A lot of people don't know that, but Lincoln, as good a president as he was, really messed things up that way. because he opened the door for paper money without backing. Okay? And that was in 1863, but it was either that or the Rothschilds. Now, in 1864, a man by the name of George Pullman invented something. Now, what kind of a man with a name like Pullman, what would he invent? A railroad car, a sleeping car, a very comfortable, fancy sleeping car. Isn't that something? And his name was Pullman. That's a good name for a railroad man, huh? Okay. Am I going too fast? I'm just trying to cover some of these things that get a little of this timeline in on the tape recording, okay? Now, we are really going to have to move here. Okay. Lincoln was assassinated just as the Civil War ended in 1865. And in 1865 through 1877, the South, I mentioned this last time too, went through a period of Reconstruction. They weren't just admitted back into the Union right away. They had to prove themselves loyal. And Northerners called carpetbaggers and scallywags came down and looted the South, took over the land, confiscated it, and just ran roughshod over those poor people who had been wiped out. And a lot of the blacks sided or got in with some of these carpetbaggers. They were called carpetbaggers because they were known to carry carpet bags with them. You know what a carpet bag is. So they were just called that. Now, a notable invention came forth in 1866. Cyrus Field was a man that put the first cable under the Atlantic Ocean. Now you could send telegraph messages to Europe. You could get a message there in minutes instead of days. Way back in 1866, he laid cable transatlantic. That's quite an accomplishment, isn't it? I mean, these people back then were not dummies. The people that live today are extremely stupid compared to people who lived in the past. They had almost nothing to work with, and they did all this stuff. We get everything handed to us. I mean, if we need a light, we go out and buy an electric light and screw it in. Can you imagine having to invent one? Huh? It's a good thing the people that are alive now didn't live back then. We'd still be burning candles. Okay? They were different. They were ambitious. They were very intelligent. And then in 1867, I mentioned that United States bought Alaska from Russia for $7 million. Remember what that really was? It was payment for the use of the Russian Navy by Abraham Lincoln. And William Seward actually arranged for it. He was the Secretary of State. Abraham Lincoln and William Seward were the only two non-Masons in the government, in the high level of the government. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, which granted citizenship to former slaves in the United States and made them citizens. And in that same year, President Johnson was impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. Okay? He was acquitted by one vote. Impeachment meant he would have been removed as president. See, Andrew Johnson was the governor of Tennessee for a while. Lincoln chose him to be his vice president. When Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson came in, and Johnson, being a Southerner, was hated by the radical Republicans of Ohio particularly. And the radical Republicans, the fringe, the far, 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 far right fringe, had all this hatred for him, and so they trumped up charges against him. But he was not removed from office. Almost. No president has ever been impeached. Okay, as far as, I should say, convicted on impeachment. The only one to be impeached was Andrew Johnson. There's one right now that should be impeached and removed as quickly as possible. That's the one we have right now. In 1869, the first transcontinental railroad was finished, at Promontory Point, Utah. It linked the two coasts together. Now you could take a railroad train from the east coast to the west coast. In 1869, the same year, George Westinghouse patented the air brake, which replaced the railroad's hand brake. The railroad was the big transportation method at that time. A labor union was formed that same year called the Knights of Labor. It was formed by a Jewish man, and it became a movement of the people, a labor union. This was expanded later on. Now, the 15th Amendment came forth in 1870, and that was ratified, granting black adult males the right to vote. Notice, black adult males. Who was allowed to vote before that? Notice, women still couldn't vote. You know what you had to do to be able to vote in this country for many, many years? You had to be a white male property owner. If you were a renter, you could not vote. You had to own property. And it was set up that way for a reason. They didn't want people that would move around and be transient. They were looked at as troublemakers. They wanted the stable, solid people. Did you know that almost every farmer is a Republican to this very day? Because they stay put. They're conservative, basically. And the Democrats were looked at as people who moved around a lot and took advantage of others. So traditionally, that's how it was. In 1871, Mrs. O'Leary left her lantern in the shed and burned down Chicago. Okay? The Great Chicago Fire destroyed a whole 1/3 of the city. In 1876, our nation celebrated something. What was it? 1876. A centennial. 100 years since the Declaration of Independence. That same year, Alexander Bell applies for a patent for the telephone. That same year that Alexander Bell applied for the patent of the telephone, 1876, there was a battle called the Little Bighorn. The Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, who fought in that battle of the Little Bighorn? General George Armstrong Custer. And he fought a Sioux chief. The Sioux and Cheyenne, actually, were both fighting in that, named Sitting Bull. This was out in Montana. And the problem was, you know what the controversy was over? Sitting Bull didn't like the fact that the iron horses were running through his country. The railroad. They hated the railroad. And it was like a holy war to the Indians. They did not want this belching, steam, puffing thing come tromping through their land. Okay, they were kind of superstitious about it. Okay, Shirley? What's that? Well, yeah, the railroad did that. It scared all their... See, the Indians had to have buffaloes to live. The American bison, the buffalo. And the railroad scared all went through their hunting grounds, scared all these creatures away, so it greatly hurt them. In 1878, Thomas Alva Edison invented the incandescent light bulb. We've got some right up here. Quite an invention. And the year before, he had invented something called a phonograph. He was the most prolific inventor that ever lived. He invented a lot of things. Okay, Sarah? They're still burning. He had a laboratory at Menlo Park. He's had other areas where he has worked. And in fact, up in Appleton, here in Wisconsin, there is a house that's right on the Fox River. In fact, the magician Harry Houdini, his real name was Eric Weiss. His father was a rabbi. He lived in that house for a while. But that house, it's right on the Fox River. right near the Memorial Street Bridge, was the first house ever hooked up to hydroelectric power, and Thomas Edison himself wired that entire house. Those light bulbs, the original switches are there, the original light bulbs are there and still burning. Can you imagine that? Now, why do you think it is that we have to go down to the store all the time and buy light bulbs? To make money. Very good. You know, if you had light bulbs that never burned out, that'd put the industry in a pretty bad way. But you can make light bulbs that never burn out. Okay? Now, the rest of the period from 1880 to 1900, a lot of things took place. There was President James Garfield, who 4 months into office was shot and killed by a mentally unbalanced seeker of a government job, as they say. Actually, James A. Garfield was an Illuminist. He was a member of various secret societies. And there are a lot of intrigue about that. Also, the American Red Cross was founded by a woman named Clara Barton. And she was a Civil War nurse. She was called the Angel of the Battlefield, and she is the one who started the Red Cross. In 1886, the American Federation of Labor was formed, another labor union. And all of these labor unions were started by Jews, which I think is rather interesting. Samuel Gompers, and a lot of was one of the big ones. And a lot of these other ones, they're all of the same ilk, you might say. But the AFL, American Federation of Labor, later combined with the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, and the AFL-CIO, and then all of its affiliates. And they're very, very communistic. At first, they did make some good major reforms, but afterward they became very, very communistic. And after all, communism is called what? A movement of the workers. Okay? In 1888, a man named George Eastman invented something that became real popular. What do you think Eastman invented? A small, inexpensive what? Camera! And he called his camera not a camera, he called it a Kodak. There were no cameras, they were all Kodaks. That was the name of it. And the Eastman Kodak Company was founded. In 1892, Populist Party was founded. And they, of course, were a radical group, you might say. They weren't considered mainstream. A lot of these fringe groups began to form. Now, I'll get into more of that later and the reason for it. But I've got to move along rather quickly. In 1893, there was another panic, business failures, unemployment. They had to call the National Guard out, and they were literally shooting people in the streets. When you take the money away from people, they go wild. Like I say, this is the most spoiled generation we've ever had, and when it hits, it's really going to hit. In 1896, William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska was the populist candidate for president and could have won, but William McKinley did win. Strangely enough, William McKinley was assassinated while in office. In 1898, Hawaii was annexed by the United States at the request of Americans that were living there. It was in 1901 that President McKinley was assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt then took over as president. And that same year of 1901, the United States Steel Corporation formed by a man named J. Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan. And this was the first billion-dollar corporation ever formed in the country. President Roosevelt, in 1902, this is Teddy Roosevelt, intervened in a coal strike in Pennsylvania in support of the labor unions. He was the union man. Very strong for the Unions. 1903, two brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, invented something. What was it? The Wright brothers. The airplane, as Orville said to Wilbur, "You're right." And they flew it at Kitty Hawk in what state? What state has on its license plates first in flight? North Carolina. We were just down there. All the license plates say first in flight. That was at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. In 1904 to 1914, the Panama Canal was constructed. Oh, incidentally, in 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out because Cuba and Puerto Rico were both colonized by American citizens, and the American citizens wanted to just take over like they did in Texas, and Spain said, "No, those are our islands, you can't have them." The United States said, "Well, we're going to protect our citizens that are living there," so they put some gunboats out there. And there was a certain battleship called the Maine, the USS Maine, which was docked off from Havana, Cuba, out into the water a little ways, and it was sunk. There was an explosion and it sunk. And so the United States declared war on Spain. As a result, Spain ended up relinquishing Puerto Rico and Cuba. Okay? Now we're getting up, finally, to where things are developing into a world war. How much time? Oh, 2 minutes. How am I going to do this? Since I've got this set up, I'll tell you what, I'm the teacher. I'm going to take 7 minutes. 7 minutes. You can give me an extra 5. Well, you won't give me anything. I'll take it. I'll be the dictator here. We're going to be talking about dictators anyway, so here goes. In our Bibles, in Matthew 24, the Lord told us this. Matthew 24:6, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." The Lord foretold that there would be a period of time when there would be great wars, rumors of wars. And that time did come. Now what I want to do over the next 5 minutes, and I will stop. My watch was fast. My watch actually is a little fast. It's not 8:30 yet. I'm 2 minutes fast here. Okay. Let's turn the light out, the big light. What I will do in this remaining 5 minutes is I'm going to give you a very quick overview of World War I and what developed. Next week I'm going to literally teach just on that subject and progress toward World War II. Okay? I think we can still get this all in. We talked about J.P. Morgan forming that U.S. Steel Company. He was a banker, and the lower picture shows J.P. Morgan. There's a picture of what he looked like. He created an artificial panic used as an excuse to pass the Federal Reserve Act, which I will explain later. And another number of things that he did propelled this country into World War I. The picture that you see above there is Professor Carroll Quigley of Harvard, Princeton, Georgetown universities. He taught various places. He wrote a book, and I have a copy of it at home. And in this book, he lays out the whole conspiracy. He himself was one of them, but he wrote this book. It's a huge, thick book, about 800 pages. He wrote it for his fellow conspirators. He didn't think anybody else would even be interested in it, but it really let the cat out of the bag. Okay? So that's why his picture is on there, but more later. Briefly, Other men instrumental in this, World War I, was Lord Alfred Milner, a wealthy Englishman, who helped to finance and engineer the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and Jacob H. Schiff, the man on the right. This is Lord Milner here. This is John Jacob Schiff, a Rothschild agent who gave $20 million in gold to the Bolshevik Revolution. As I said, I'm only touching this. I'm going to give you the whole story next week on how communism was put in Russia by the United States. And I will proceed to prove that. President Woodrow Wilson, well, here's the real president, E. Mandel House, Edward M. House. President Wilson's closest friend. Wilson did everything he told him. House was actually a Rothschild agent. He was a Jewish man, and he literally ran the country and engineered the war from over here. Private advisor. Yep. And here the two of them are seen together. Now, how do you think, just briefly, how do you think Woodrow Wilson and Bill Clinton are similar? Well, I suppose there's a number of things, but in the way that they were elected. Does anybody think they know? Here's what happened. The reason Woodrow Wilson was elected with a minority vote, because he was running against William Howard Taft. Roosevelt was out of the running. But Teddy Roosevelt then formed his own Bull Moose Party, a third party, and that split the Republican vote and allowed Woodrow Wilson to get into the White House. Wilson was a high-ranking Illuminist, university professor. He was also an Illuminist. Bill Clinton was running against, you know, don't you? George Bush. What allowed Bill Clinton to win? Ross Perot, a third party, came along and split the vote. Nobody thought Ross Perot would get the amount of votes that he got. But it was enough to tip the scale and cause enough havoc. Also, Ross Perot entered the race near the end, just exactly 33 days before the election. 33 is a number sacred to the Freemasons. Okay? What started the war, of course, was Archduke Francis Ferdinand, Archduke of Austria, the Empire of Austria-Hungary. There he is with his wife, about to get in the car. A member of an Illuminati organization called the Serbian Black Hand Society assassinated him, shot him as soon as he got in the vehicle. That started World War I because Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and then various other nations joined in on one side or the other, and before long you had a world war. The United States was not in the war, however. And when Woodrow Wilson was running for president, his campaign speech was, "Elect the man who will keep your sons out of the war." At the same time he was making speeches like that, he was already preparing to get the United States into the war. I've got 2 minutes yet. I'm just giving you a brief touch of this. Next time you'll get a lot more. We'll go in depth into World War I. The sinking of the Lusitania was said to be the excuse to get the United States into the war. The Lusitania was said to be a passenger ship full of innocent people. And the Germans had what were called U-boats. U-boats were submarines. Can anybody here guess why U-boat warfare was thought to be inhumane? Why do you think? Why was U-boat, submarine warfare, thought to be inhumane? Well, actually what it was, you're on to it, but actually the real reason for it is you couldn't take any prisoners. There was no room for them. They'd have to die. If you knocked out a ship, you couldn't take survivors. So it was considered to be inhumane. Okay? Now, the truth about the Lusitania is, I should really save this for next time, it was not a passenger ship. There were passengers on it. But Life magazine admitted later, and I knew it before that too, it was a ship of the line. It was full of British armaments, weapons of war. It was a commissioned warship by Great Britain. And the man who arranged for the sinking of the Lusitania was the Lord of the Admiralty, a man by the name of Sir Winston Churchill, who had recently joined what was called the League of Just Men, an Illuminati organization. He also was a member of the Society of Druids. Sir Winston Churchill. More about Churchill later. I got a million things to tell you about all of this. But you'll notice, a lot of people said, well, those innocent people got on that ship thinking it was just a passenger ship. No, they were warned. Germany had agents. See this little notice right here? Imperial German Embassy. Travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies in Great Britain. The war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles and so forth, and it warns the people, don't get on that ship. And if they're getting on that ship, they're doing so at their own risk. So Germany was there telling these people, don't get on this ship. They stood at the dock and handed out the notices. But you don't get that in the history books too much either, do you? Or in school. They still want you to think that the Germans are these awful people, and they're all a bunch of, all these old sayings, all the Germans smell like rats and sauerkraut, and Germans are all mean, they're all ugly. No, just certain ones, just like in any culture. Okay? So that's the Lusitania. I really have to stop at this point. I got a lot of things to tell you about the war. And by the way, World War I, the first one to use this method of warfare. There's some old planes. Looks like something Snoopy would fly. And the Red Baron, right? Baron von Richthofen. Anyway, so much for this time. We are out of time. I went 5 minutes over, but we started 10 minutes late. So, if you'd stand with me, we will have a word of prayer in closing. Father in heaven, again, we thank Thee for this class, and I pray now that Thou wouldst help us to somehow retain what we've learned, and that we would be able to use this somehow to the benefit of Thy kingdom. We know, Lord, that there's a lot of detail here, but help our minds to be sharp and clear so that we can give Thee the glory in all things and impart whatever wisdom we have to others. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay.